Good morning. I'm Fred Bushak, graduate student pursuing Homeland Security at the George Washington University College of Professional Studies. The sarin gas subway attacks in Japan in 1995 and the anthrax attacks in the United States 2001 were wake-up calls for both countries about their emergency management preparedness to successfully respond and recover from the WMD attacks. Therefore, this presentation will focus on the challenges both countries face in implementing the key factors of the emergency management plans, that's leadership, strategic platform, and communication. Also, I will speak about how these emergency management plans compare to each other and the lessons that can be learned from both incidences. I'm going to speak on the anthrax attacks first. So in 2001, the anthrax attack in the United States killed 5 people and contaminated 22. This initiated a broad range of emergency management activities, which raised questions about how the U.S. responded to the attacks with regards to how leadership conducted investigations, particularly about the motives and possible suspects of the attack, how the various agencies from the federal, state, and local agencies worked together during the response and recovery operations, and how the agencies used the existing communication plan to interact with each other as well as other relevant outside stakeholders. Leadership. The growing sense of urgency for the FBI to crack the case led to a series of investigative blunders that undermined the public and stakeholders' confidence in the agency. The FBI, rather than conducting a thorough investigation, wasted millions of taxpayers' dollars and resources to push a suspect for confession. The leader made wrong decisions in a desperate move to indict Dr. Hatfield. For instance, despite the lack of physical evidence, the then FBI Director Robert Mueller insisted that his agents stay after Dr. Hatfield, whom the agent had initially identified as their prime suspect. Also, the wrongful accusation of Dr. Hatfield by the then Attorney General Ashcroft at what has now become the infamous press conference further undermined the confidence and trust of the general public and other relevant stakeholders in the FBI and DOJ investigations. This later led to a lawsuit which was brought by Dr. Hatfield and won $5.8 million for violation of his rights and privacy. Strategic platform. Prior to the attacks, there were no formal emergency management plan in place to activate interagency cooperation to respond to a WMD attacks in the United States. As a result, all strategic platforms that were created to enhance interagency coordination were ad hoc. The FBI set up an incident command system to enhance interagency cooperation during the anthrax investigation. Through this cooperation, the FBI was able to seek the assistance of USAMRIID to help in conducting or examining the substance that was uncovered from the attack scene. USAMRIID later confirmed that the material or substances that were recovered from the scene was indeed anthrax. Communication plan. There were no existing communication guidelines for interagency cooperation. As a result, some local health officials were prevented from releasing information because of the ongoing criminal investigation. Officials indicated that fear in impacted communities could have been curtailed if they had been able to release information to the media and the public. It was unclear what information public officials could release about the investigation because of the lack of guidelines. However, a notable exception was in Connecticut, where a small group of epidemiologists defied the FBI and released information about the illness of an elderly woman who subsequently died from the anthrax attack. Also, the DOJ, which was part of the investigation, did not have an effective communication structure to interact with the media. In the hastily organized press briefing, the Attorney General Ashcroft was ill prepared and could not provide answers to the media justifying why, for instance, Dr. Hatfield was their prime suspect. The Tokyo subway attacks. On March 20, 1995, 5 cult members from the terrorist group known as Shirinko attacked 3 subway stations in Tokyo. The attacks involved the use of sarin gas, which left 12 dead, hundreds injured, and thousands terrorized. Leadership. Failure on the part of the Japanese leadership to handle the emergency management crisis before, during, and after the sarin gas attacks was more of an institutional challenge. The inability on the part of the Japanese authorities to stop the Tokyo subway system attacks was born out of intentional lack of oversight and failure on the part of leadership to systematically and routinely learn from the group's previous attacks. For instance, despite the group's violent history and record of its previous attacks in Matsumoto, which left 7 people dead and about 500 hospitalized in 1994, that was a year prior to the Tokyo subway attack, the group was neither investigated nor put under surveillance. The group, which operated in disguise as a religious body, was able to escape law enforcement scrutiny because of institutional barriers against religious persecution. Strategic platform. There were no existing guidelines detailing how to respond to weapons of mass destruction attack in Japan. That's, for instance, even if the inexperienced response personnel had identified the nature of the incident, they would not have had plans to guide them in how to proceed. Also, bureaucratic barriers hindered the immediate recognition and response. The agencies in Japan do not usually work together, but rather work separately from, or in some cases compete with one another. Even when agencies does its job, the lack of cross-agency communication and cooperation hinder effective response and recovery operations. For instance, for months following the attack, the Japanese self-defense forces, who are well-trained and properly equipped, were unwilling to fully cooperate with the police during the early stages of the disaster. Communication. There was no existing communication plan during the response and recovery operations in the Tokyo subway attacks. The absence of incident command system meant that each individual agency had their own spokesperson. Information that was relayed by the agencies contradicted each other, and during most press conferences, the authorities could not provide answers to questions asked by the media. The inability of the Japanese authorities to frame the disaster as the WMD attacks led to rumors and undermined the confidence of the general public and other stakeholders in their investigations. The public trusted the media than the Japanese authorities. Comparison analysis of the two attacks. Leadership. In the US, leadership failure was in part due to pressure on the FBI to crack the investigation, whereas in Japan, existing constitutional and religious bureaucracies hindered investigations. During investigation into the anthrax attacks in the US, enormous pressure that was placed on the FBI and the DOJ to crack the investigation led to a series of poor leadership decisions by the agencies. For instance, the decision to hastily organize press conference, as I've already mentioned, by the AG asked us to announce to the media that Dr. Hartsfield was their main suspect undermined the confidence of the DOJ investigation. In the case of the sarin gas attacks in Tokyo, even though there were a series of reports against Erim Shorinko, the police were unable to investigate them for fear of being criticized for religious intimidation. Strategic platform. Both jurisdictions had no strategic platform specifically established to respond to a WMD attacks. However, there were ample coordination among law enforcement and other agencies in the United States than the Japanese counterpart. Though there were no standardized and strategic platform for coordinating WMD attacks in both jurisdictions, collaboration between law enforcement agencies and first responders in the US were more effective in the anthrax attacks. There was a broad range of cooperation between the FBI, CDC, United States Postal Service, Department of Defense, FEMA, and other stakeholders. For instance, USAMRIID provided technical support to the EPA in testing the efficacy of response techniques, and the FBI in collaboration with the DOJ-led criminal investigation of the anthrax release. On the other hand, the existence of cataloged bureaucracy in Japan hindered first responders to effectively coordinate with each other. For instance, the self-defense forces, despite being trained and well-equipped, were not used because of complicated formalities during the early stages of the attack. Communication. Based on my research prior to this presentation, neither the US nor the Japanese counterpart had an established communication plan prior to the attacks. In the US, law enforcement and other responding agencies were able to communicate among themselves. However, Even after it has emerged that the incidents of WMD attacks, the FBI and the DOJ struggled to provide answers about their investigations to the media because they did not have the facts at the time of the press conference. This was largely because the FBI had not established any communication guidelines. On the other hand, thus in Japan, not only was the law enforcement agencies in Japan faced with challenges communicating among themselves and the media, but there were also infrastructural and technological challenges such as sustainability, funding, changing rules and norms, which undermine communication interoperability among agencies. So these are the lessons that could be learned comparing these two incidents, that the sarin gas attacks and the anthrax attacks in the United States. One, there is the need for greater coordination among first responders and other agencies involved in counter WMD terrorism planning, especially law enforcement agencies such as the FBI. The roles of all responding agencies must be clearly reviewed and formally defined, followed with adequate education and training on how plans should be implemented. Also, there should be the need to establish a designated directorate of WMD, which will be the main fusion center to coordinate all responses and recovery operations regarding a WMD attack. 2. Establish a communication plan before crisis to achieve a high level of preparedness. This will include identifying the hierarchy of who will speak for all responding agencies, also outlining the core crisis message into this crisis plan as templates, publicizing the crisis resolution actions through media partnership, acquiring new technologies to enhance interoperability, and finally training of spokespersons. 3. And this particularly goes to Japan, eliminating institutional bureaucracies, constitutional law, and religious and cultural liberties which hinder law enforcement from conducting investigations into suspected terrorist groups. And lastly, there should be the need to create a strategic platform that will enhance interagency cooperation between law enforcement agencies and public health officials to promote proper asset deployment, flexibility, and management. Thank you, and this concludes my presentation.